Before we explore the early cinema of sub-Saharan Africans, it's important to understand what is African indigeneity. Before the main colonization of Africa by Europe, it was home to hundreds of vibrant and dynamic cultures populating all parts of the vast continent. Africa had many complex traditional beliefs particular to each tribe, centered around animism and ancestor worship. In terms of an indigenous African identity, indigenous Africans were culturally altered by external influences much earlier than European colonization. Abrahamic religions, for instance, began entering Africa as early as the 7th century, when refugees from the Arab Peninsula began converting Africans to Islam. In the early 15th century, the Portuguese began to convert Africans to Christianity. The 16th century saw the transatlantic slave trade. For over 366 years, over 12 million Africans were sent overseas. Then colonization occurred between 1881 and 1914. Nearly all of Africa was invaded, occupied, divided, and colonized by 7 European powers: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Italy. It was called the Scramble for Africa. Africans became second-class citizens, subjugated on their own continent. They had to adopt European culture and assimilate. It was during this time that cinema was used as a colonization tool to ensure loyalty and assimilation of African subjects before the 1960s. Colonial-era films also portrayed Africa as exotic, without history or culture. How fitting, then, that cinema would later be subverted into a tool to celebrate the re-emerging African identity after colonization. Independence movements began weakening European powers post-World War II. The 50s, 60s, and 70s saw African colonies liberated from Europe. Though post-colonialism and neo-colonialism were alive and well, Africans now had to re-examine who they were, their roots, their religions, their political systems, their culture's hybridization, in a sense asking, who were we before being taken over by other cultures, and who are we now that we're liberated? It was in this period that indigenous African cinema developed. While it was literature that first expressed the effects of colonialism, most Africans were illiterate at the time. Therefore, cinema was the perfect medium to connect with the oral and visual traditions of African storytelling and reach beyond the cultural elites. While filmmakers with distinct cultures and voices arose in several West African states during this time, Senegal is considered the birthplace of indigenous African cinema after its liberation in 1960, in particular with the work of the father of African film, Usman Semben. Semben made the first film by an African, about an African, in Africa, with his 1963 short, Barom Saret, The Wagoner. He was born in 1923 in a Senegalese riverport fishing town called Ziguinchor. His family was part of the Lebu tribe, a subsect of the Greater Wolof ethnic group. Senegal had become a French colony in 1895 after several decades of invasion, though the Wolof people had governed their lands for over 800 years prior to colonialism. Semben was illiterate, working in various manual labor jobs before being drafted into the army. He was also involved in the trade union movement and the Communist Party. While working as a docker in France, he broke his back. Unable to work, he taught himself to read and write, beginning a successful literary career. He then studied at the Gorky Film Studio Film School in Moscow in 1962, and began making short films by age 40. Concerned with social change, he hoped to reach the wide African audiences who could not read. In the French colonies, Africans were prohibited from making films of their own by the 1934 Laval Decree. But it was lifted with West Africa's independence. His first short, Barom Saret, was about a poor cart driver trying unsuccessfully to make a living in post-colonial Dakar, the largest city in Senegal. As a Marxist, Semben shows incredible poverty and that independence has not solved the problems of its people. The stark social stratification still oppress the poor majority. By 1966, Semben released Black Girl, or its French title La Noire de, considered the first major film produced by an African filmmaker. This is a film where Semben really begins turning his camera against the colonial and neo-colonial forces in Africa. Black Girl is based on a true story about a young Senegalese woman named Douana, who moved to France to work as a nanny for a French couple. She has big dreams of living a new cosmopolitan life, but ends up as a servant facing harsh abuse from her employers, resulting in her suicide. The film deals with social hierarchies, racism, and black identity. Essentially, the whole process of colonialism in Africa is played out in a white-walled small apartment in France. The film received international recognition and the Prix Jean Vigo. In terms of preserving the culture of the Wolof people, Semben had dreamed of producing his first film in his native Wolof language, and achieved this with his 1968 sophomore film Mandabi, The Money Order. Most of his subsequent films were also in the Wolof tongue. Semben went on to direct another 7 features in the next 4 decades, contending with the struggle to secure financing in Senegal's still nascent film industry, and also the censorship of his films due to his blatant political criticism. The late 60s and early 70s also saw the rise of another Senegalese filmmaker, much more experimental, considered by many to be the African Godard, Djibril Diop Mambéty. Mambéty only lived 53 years. Born in 1945, he would die in 1998 of lung cancer. Though he only made 2 feature films and 5 shorts, his films received international acclaim. He was an ethnic Wolof and came from a Muslim family. His father had been a part of the Libu tribe, the same as Usman Semben. Mambéty trained as an actor, but is a self-taught filmmaker. His work critiques neo-colonialism and is considered third cinema. After a couple satirical short films, he made his feature-length debut, Tuki Buki, The Hyena's Journey. Influenced by the French New Wave and made with a small budget from a grant from the Senegalese government, Tuki Buki uses jump cuts, colliding montage, dissonant sonic accompaniment, and juxtaposes the pre-modern with the pastoral and the modern. Mambéty has said that his unique rhythm was inspired by African oral traditions and a subversive use of the Western genre. The film is a road movie about 2 lovers from Dakar who fantasize fleeing to France, and all that the seduction of it symbolizes and entails. While the film initially failed in being received, and it would be another 20 years before Mambéty's next feature, Tuki Buki is now considered one of the most important African films ever made. Safi Faye was the first sub-Saharan African woman to direct a commercially distributed film, Kaddu Bekat, Letters from My Village. It was released in 1975. She has also directed several documentary and fiction films focusing on Senegalese rural life. Faye was born to an aristocratic Serer family in Fadjal, a village south of Dakar. In her 20s, she met filmmaker Jean Rouch, who mentored her in using cinema as an ethnographic tool. Kaddu Bekat, an experimental fiction film drawing from cinema verite, takes place in Faye's native village. The film's about a young peasant farmer who wants to get married. He must pay the traditional bride price and is forced to work in the city after a poor harvest of groundnuts. After being exploited in the city, he returns to the country to improve the farming conditions. It was initially banned in Senegal because of its criticism of national agricultural practices that were the legacy of colonialism. In closing, the birth of indigenous African cinema, along with the dawn of post-colonial Africa, featured many avant-garde and revolutionary voices that would seek to preserve and tell stories about Africans from their own perspectives.
Est-ce que vos films sont bien compris en Europe?
Non mais mettons-nous bien ça dans la tête. Moi, l'Europe n'est pas mon centre. L'Europe est une périphérie de l'Afrique. Vous voyez, ils sont restés plus de 100 ans chez moi, ils n'ont pas parlé ma langue, je parle leur langue. L'avenir, pour moi, l'avenir ne dépend pas d'être compris par l'Europe. Je souhaiterais qu'ils me comprennent, Mais ça ne me fait absolument rien. Si vous prenez la carte de l'Afrique, géographiquement, vous pouvez mettre l'Europe et l'Amérique et il nous restera encore de la place. Pourquoi voulez-vous que je me... Ce tropisme, vous savez, le tropisme, pourquoi voulez-vous que je sois comme le tournesol qui tourne autour du soleil? Je suis moi-même le soleil.